Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. One of the most striking features of the debate over immigration in America is the fact that it's not much of a debate. You'll notice the failure, indeed the refusal, of our elites to grapple with what exactly it means to allow millions of low-skilled workers from around the world to move here. When it comes to details about that, they quote the Statue of Liberty and they move on quickly. Maybe they don't really want to know much about the effects of their policies. Maybe they really believe that every immigrant is a high school valedictorian or some world-class STEM talent who's only prevented from founding the next Apple or curing cancer by the bigotry of native-born Americans. Maybe they really think that. Well, either way, facts rarely enter into the conversation. It's wholly emotional. But facts still matter, and tonight we have some. A new study by the Federation for American Immigration Reform finds that this country's approximately 11 million illegal immigrants cost taxpayers about $135 billion per year in medical, education, and law enforcement expenses. Now, there's an offset to this, taxes. And yet, according to the study, these illegal immigrants pay only about $19 billion a year in taxes. That leaves a deficit, which you pay, of $116 billion. Now, even by Washington standards, that's a huge number. To put it into some perspective, Americans spend only about $70 billion every year paying tuition at public colleges and universities. So if you eliminated the expenses of illegal immigrants, we could make every public college in the country tuition-free and still have nearly $50 billion left over to, I don't know, fix decaying infrastructure or subsidize health insurance to the middle class, or probably a lot more. So it's worth considering as we debate border control and amnesty these numbers. But we also have another set of numbers, these from the Center for Immigration Studies on chain migration. Now, when advocates in New York or Washington tell you about immigration, they always pretend as if there's an economic rationale for it. It's important, like every immigrant is a high-qualified expert in a coveted field and needs to be here for the sake of our economy. In fact, according to the numbers, government numbers, your typical immigrant to the U.S. is simply related to somebody who's already here, usually a previous immigrant. According to DHS data, in recent years, every so-called initiating immigrant, the first one, has brought an average of 3.5 family members into the country with him. For some countries, the rate is even higher. Each legal immigrant from Mexico has brought an average of more than 6 additional family members here as well. Now, many of these family members have little prospect for contributing economically. For instance, 24% of immigrants are older than 50. So if they become U.S. citizens, they can become eligible for Social Security and Medicare despite paying very little into those programs. Now, none of this is an attack on anyone as an individual. We're willing to believe that most of these people, these immigrants, are good people because they likely are good people. But it's still an extremely expensive proposition for America, far more than most people understand. Now, all of this ought to weigh heavily on Congress as it debates passing an amnesty for DACA beneficiaries. Supposedly, this will only benefit a small group, a limited group of illegal immigrants who came here as kids. But if 700,000 DACA recipients become legal citizens, of course, they, under the rules of chain migration, will bring many more. Estimates suggest millions more, including parents and siblings who may also have entered this country illegally. Now, wherever you are on this question, these are serious matters. They deserve a serious debate in Congress, and yet don't count on that happening. On the left, the only interest is admitting as many immigrants as possible for the sake of getting and holding political power. That's the whole game right there. And on the right, many Republicans only care about pleasing the business interests that fund their campaigns, who'd like to see labor costs kept as low as possible, and low-wage immigration certainly does that. The concerns of regular voters, those who worry about their ability to stay afloat with stagnant wages, pay their mortgage, send their kids to summer camp, pay off their car loan, fear losing their cultural cohesion of their country, no one cares about them. If they think about those worries at all in Congress, it's only to tell voters their concerns are silly, illegitimate, and they're bigots for having them. Joining us now, 2 men behind the studies we just told you about. Mark Krikorian, the Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. Dan Stein is President of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, FAIR, and they're both in the studio tonight. Thanks both for joining us very much. So Dan, first to you. You produced a study that we just referred to that estimates the costs of illegal immigration. It's very different from the estimates that I hear from people I talk to on this show who are proponents of illegal immigration. Tell us how you got to
Well, the main reason is it's about assumptions. They often mix legal and illegal immigrants, and they parsed the data to try to produce these results. We went down and scrubbed the basic raw data from states and local governments when you can get it, from Pew, estimates from the Center for Immigration Studies, and put them together with updated assumptions, and taking a look at criminal justice costs. The children of illegal immigrants cost tremendous amounts in educational care. That's part of the reason why they underestimate the cost. They don't look at education costs, particularly for children of illegal immigrants who are U.S. citizens.
They don't even count
You have to include, no, you have to include those. And they tend to overestimate the taxes. Tucker, low-skill immigration is inappropriate to our U.S. economy. We don't import buggy whips. We shouldn't be importing low-skill immigrants. Most illegal immigrants, low-skill, average income, $36,000 a year. Negative federal tax liability. What you're doing is privatizing profits while commonizing costs on the taxpayer. It's a net loss for the community, for the American community, to be admitting or allowing illegal immigration to occur.
It's a net gain for rich neighborhoods because you get cheap help.
Right, but the problem is, as Mark Stein likes to say, eventually you run out of neighborhoods, and so they start moving in.
No, it's totally true. So the other assumption that drives me crazy, Mark Krikorian, is that when advocates for illegal immigration say, well, we're going to grant amnesty to X number of people, that's the actual number. And your study suggests the real number is, in fact, much bigger.
Yeah, and clearly we've been much bigger. Now, it would be over a period of years. But if, for instance, Congress just amnestied the people who have this DACA amnesty that Obama illegally gave out, 700,000 people, we're talking at least 1.5 million people over the next number of years that would be coming in after them. But that's actually the narrowest possibility. Senator Durbin and Senator Lindsey Graham have a bill that would not just look at those young people who are covered by this DACA amnesty, but would just open a whole new can of worms from scratch.
So we admit about, I think it's what you would know, about 1.1 million legal immigrants a year. And that's the number I always go with, but that's not the real number, it sounds like.
Well, I mean, in a sense it is, but it would be going up if we legalize more people.
No, but I mean, because of chain migration, which applies to all legal immigrants,
right,
that means you have a net gain of a lot more people than just that every year.
The long-term effect is enormous. For instance, these amnesties in the Senate that they're talking about, dream amnesties, they would amnesty 2 to 3 million people. Bigger, some of them, than even the Reagan amnesty of 30 years ago. And so double that number for the future over the next, say, 10 or 20 years would come in, because it's like, remember there was an ad back in the 80s, a shampoo ad, where a girl loved the shampoo so much she told 2 friends, they told 2 friends, and so on, and you had these multiplying images of her. That's what this is. This is, we give a green card to an immigrant, he sponsors 2 relatives, they sponsor 2 relatives.
It's so dishonest. Riskly, Dan, how can people get away with saying that low-wage immigration is a net economic benefit to the United States? Are they lying or are they misguided?
It's about redistribution. I mean, the elites on top obviously are the ones who benefit from the redistribution. The employers benefit from the reduced wages, and the American people, average Americans, American workers, what used to be the American middle class, they get hurt. They're at the bottom. It's a complete scam. And everything about our labor force shifting to this post-industrial superpower information economy suggests that massive illegal immigration tolerated on a long-term basis, or chain migration that de-skills the labor flow, gives the American people an incredibly bad, or poorly served.
It sounds that way.
System.
So when you hear people defend it, what they're really defending is their own prerogatives. When rich people defend this, they're basically defending it because they're getting a lot out of it, but you're not.
Well, look, when in the 80s, when I had hair for shampooing, I mean, everybody knew people who actually had relatives doing the work, the hard work. And social distance has increased to the point now where elites are completely detached about the tremendous, terrible impacts systemic illegal immigration and chain migration are having on the American people.
I totally agree with that. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
So are immigration advocates concerned with the prospects of chain migration creating a de facto amnesty, or hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars going to support illegal immigrants instead of funding college and infrastructure? Simon Rosenberg, the founder of the New Democrat Network. He's an advocate for immigration, and he joins us tonight. Simon, thanks a lot for coming on.
Good to be here.
So I guess look, you can debate the numbers, but what you can't debate is that the numbers matter. And I can say from firsthand experience, having had dozens, scores, hundreds of these debates, that you never meet anyone on the left who says, here's the economic justification for these policies. It's always the Statue of Liberty tells us this. It's a country based on immigration. It's like facts don't play a role in this debate on the left.
Well, let's talk about the report you referenced
Please.
earlier, right? Is that, and the facts there, is that, you know, you presented a balance sheet, right? There was income and expenditures, there were costs and incomes. They left out a big sort of benefit on a positive side of the balance sheet, which is GDP, right? I mean, this, you're talking about illegal immigrants make up about 5% of all workers in America, which is close to $1 trillion a year of productivity coming out of the United States. So the costs, which I think are wildly inflated, and I could debate this with you for a long time, the net benefit to the country is still in the hundreds of billions of dollars if you have an honest balance sheet. And that was a dishonest balance sheet.
No. Actually, your accounting, clearly you've lived in Washington a while, is using GDP as the measure of prosperity, which is not actually...
GDP is a measure of productivity. No, it's a measure of...
Right, no. Actually, and if you run a business, you know, it doesn't matter how much you make. It matters how much you make minus what you spend.
No, but the business also has a net worth, right? And so part of the whole premise of GDP is that the workers of the United States, not the business, the workers create a certain amount of wealth. But it's $18 trillion a year, and the segment of that is made up by undocumented immigrants in the United States is close to $1 trillion of value a year.
But what you're assuming, what you're assuming, and what you're leaving out, you're assuming that were they to leave, those jobs would not be filled by Americans.
No, I'm just saying.
You're also eliding over the fact that you have almost 100 million Americans of working age not working. So I wonder if that has an effect, if that is affected at all by immigration.
This is basic economics 101.
No, I'm engaging in basic economics. You're engaging in Washington-based economics, which is like everything's fine.
Nice, true. No, I'm answering your question. You asked me to come on and talk about this study, and what I'm saying to you is that the balance sheet that they present in the study is not accurate.
So are you saying that having 11 million illegal immigrants in the country, almost all of them working for low wages, almost all of them with low education, is a net
who are working, yeah, who are working,
and sending a huge proportion of what they make abroad to foreign countries?
A portion.
A big proportion. It's the single biggest cash flow into the country of Mexico. It's a big country.
I understand all this.
You're saying that's a net economic gain for the United States?
There's no question about that. And the report wildly inflates.
No question.
No, there's no question based on Economics 101, right? We're talking about $1 trillion worth of GDP produced by this workforce, right?
So that answers...
And so, because, let me finish, right? Is that because, as you know, Hispanic immigrants in particular have the highest worker participation rates of any demographic group in the United States, right? They work, right? Because if they don't work, they don't get welfare. And so if they don't work, they have to go home, right?
Actually, they do get welfare in a lot of ways, of course. I mean, their kids go to the schools, they get free medical care in hospitals.
That's not welfare. I mean,
well, actually, it's publicly subsidized
but that's not
services.
Welfare.
Well, you can call it what you want. It's something you didn't pay for. You're getting free from taxpayers.
Except they, as the study shows, right, these undocumented immigrants do pay lots of taxes.
But let me just ask you this, since you've noted a couple times you've got a PhD in Economics 101, as you put it. The law of supply and demand, which you'll acknowledge is a law, says that if you have an overabundance of something, its value falls. That's why sand is cheap. If you bring in over 1 million low-wage workers every year into a country with a finite population, what do you think happens to the value of work at the low end of the scale? Do you think it rises? Do you think wages go up when you do that?
No, I think the debate that you're trying to have here, I think, is a good one, right? Which is, what is the right number for people to come in? How do we make sure that assimilation is taking place?
I'm just pointing out that what you're saying is just kind of silly, actually.
Oh, please, Tucker.
No, I'm serious.
So here's where we are in the United States today, right? We have one of the lowest unemployment rates that we've had in the modern history of the country.
Do you think that's
incomes have gone up now at a very rapid rate 2 years in a row. They're coming back from the Great Recession that took place. We have the highest stock market in the history of the country. The economy is not suffering in the way that many represent who come on the show. And so the point is that I would argue that in a time where we have very low unemployment rates, we've had incomes are going up at the highest they've ever been, we have the highest stock market in the history of the country, and high corporate valuations.
What you're saying is you're going on and giving me the propaganda points that I hear every day, but they don't reflect the condition of the country outside of the zip codes you and I live in.
That's not true.
You've got 95 million people of working age who are not working.
Right.
That's a disaster.
The unemployment rate in Iowa is 3.1%. The unemployment rate in Wisconsin is 3.7%.
But that's below full employment. But the unemployment rate is different from the reality of work. If you have 95 million people who are not working, in some cases for good reason, in a lot of cases because they're on disability, that is not good for your country. It may not be reflected in the unemployment rate. It's reflected in the death rate from opiate OD, though, and a lot of other measures.
And so is that immigrants' fault?
I'm saying that people have seen their wages decline at the lower end. American-born workers have, and immigration is one part of that. Why not just admit it?
What we know from studies that we've done, my own organization has done, is that the impact on the lower end of the workforce with the rates of immigration we've had is demonstrable, right? there is no question about it.
Then we agree.
No, but can I finish?
Yeah, of course.
So, but overall net, right, for the economy, what I just argued is that for the country as a whole, the rate of immigration that we've had has produced far more benefits than costs.
Okay,
and I think that is an indisputable. I think that's an indisputable fact.
Now
right?
you're filibustering.
So
Let me just say, hold on. No, you said it,
yeah.
but I'm just to make the obvious point, which you conceded, which is
yeah.
those benefits, like all economic benefits in the last 40 years, have not been evenly distributed. Parts of the country are dying, and our part is thriving.
Right.
And I just think we should admit it. That's
right.
all I'm saying.
Look, I'm happy. I write about this all the time. Are we done?
Sorry,
yeah.
Louis is telling me I got to go. We got a commercial break.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Simon. Good to see you. We've spoken a lot in the last couple of days about the NFL, the world's wealthiest sports league, and currently the central figure in the war over what respect is due to our flag. It may seem like it's got nothing to do with you if you don't watch sports, but we wanted to tell you how much you are paying the NFL every year if you're a taxpayer. According to Watchdog.org, in the past 2 decades, NFL teams have received $7 billion in taxpayer support for their stadiums. Now, these stadiums, which are often privately owned, operated for a profit, are routinely financed by tax-free bonds, usually reserved for public infrastructure. The NFL enjoys a special exemption from federal antitrust law. Smaller people get really rich, you pick up the tab, and they mock the things that you care about, just so you know. Meanwhile, President Trump has continued to lob attacks at the league, at the Football League, predicting imminent disaster if they continue to let players protest during the national anthem.
The NFL is in a very bad box. You cannot have people disrespecting our national anthem, our flag, our country, and that's what they're doing. And in my opinion, the NFL has to change. Or you know what's going to happen? Their business is going to go to hell.
Mark Stein knows something about powerful organizations going into decline. He's been writing about Europe for decades. Mark Stein joins us tonight. Mark, it does seem like a kind of perverse system where U.S. taxpayers help make NFL team owners richer while they allow their employees to give the finger to the country that subsidizes them. How does that work?
Yeah, and I think the owners are actually giving the finger too, the joining hands and taking part in this subversion of a civic ritual. The justification for these subsidies by taxpayers for football stadiums, which I don't particularly agree with, but the justification for them is that somehow it is a public civic event in which the entire community can participate as a community. That's the justification for these subventions which have made these people enormously rich. You can't have that and then for these organizations to strike at the most basic civic ritual, which is standing up for the national anthem. I mean, a national anthem can be a national anthem or it can be an opportunity for self-expression, but it can't be both. The subversion of the most basic civic ritual of all by these enormously wealthy people, privileged beyond belief, is absolutely revolting.
Well, it just, has there ever been a country where the elites, the people who are supposed to be running the country, to whom the rest of us mere plebes look on in awe and ask, how should we live? We take our cues from you. Has there ever been a country where those people attack the basic symbols of the country? It seems so perverse and decadent to me.
Well, what's interesting to me about this, there are people, I've spent a lot of my time in the province of Quebec, where the Lieutenant Governor enters to the first half of God Save the Queen and the last half of O Canada, neither of which secessionist Quebecers care a hoot for. But they still all rise reluctantly to their feet and at least kind of look semi-bored as they're standing up for it. Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister of Australia, ran a campaign to get rid of the present Australian flag, but he still stands up for that flag. What is going on here is absolutely extraordinary, where people are actually taking the most basic act a citizen can do, rise to his feet when he hears the first bars of the national anthem, and have constructed an entirely different ritual around it. And to listen to people saying, oh, well, as you said yesterday, the free speech argument is completely disingenuous. These are the same people who say that if Ben Shapiro or the head of the IMF or Ayaan Hirsi Ali comes to an American college, it's so traumatizing, you have to have a safe space for them. But these same people will defend the hollowing out of one of the few communal acts remaining in a divided nation, and they will defend it on free speech grounds completely disingenuously.
What do you think would happen if NFL players did this to the Mexican flag? If they said, look, Mexico has a long history of mistreating its minorities, which it does, as you know, and we're not going to stand for the Mexican flag, and we're going to talk during the anthem. How do you think, like, MSNBC would respond to that?
Oh no, they would regard that as absolutely disgraceful. But the point here is that identity politics is all about the old Leninist thing: who is doing what to whom. So it is all right to trash icons of the American inheritance. So in the same way that for the Dallas School Board to propose getting rid of anything named after Madison, Jefferson and Franklin is fine, so it's okay to come up with your own way of respecting the American flag. And again, it's nothing to do with whether they have the right to do it.
Of course.
It's nothing to do with whether it's legal or illegal. It's just that in the realm of manners, where most of us live, where we don't require a policeman to tell us we can do something
totally
or not,
true.
This is disgraceful.
It is. Mark Stein always sums it up perfectly. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Up next, the left is obsessed with finding racism everywhere. We'll explain why, if they want to find bigotry, it may not be where they expect to find it. Also, Hollywood has become obsessed with the politics of Donald Trump and Russia. A new documentary about Armenian genocide, though, is being shunned in Los Angeles because it's, quote, too political. You know, it wasn't that long ago that calling someone a racist was a big deal. It was a devastating attack on a person's character, if not blood libel. Now, everywhere you look, people just barely to the right of Al Gore are being denounced as white supremacists, white nationalists, neo-Confederates. It happened to us last week. On a website called Mediaite, blogger Justin Baragona wrote a piece entitled "Tucker Carlson Isn't Even Trying to Hide His White Nationalist Leanings Anymore." His evidence for this? Well, it was a segment we did pointing out that the Democratic Party has basically given up trying to appeal to the American middle class and has started openly encouraging illegal immigration. We didn't mention race at all because it's irrelevant. Stagnant blue-collar wages hurt black Americans in St. Louis every bit as much as they hurt white Americans in Des Moines. So how exactly does that qualify as white nationalism? Well, Justin Baragona didn't explain, nor did he accept our invitation to come on this show and lay out his reasoning, because like an awful lot of name-callers, he's a coward. Too bad. It would have been interesting to hear someone tell us exactly what a white nationalist is and how we qualify. Baragona is not the first person to make that charge, by the way. It's absurd and untrue, not to mention conveniently imprecise, so typically we just shrug it off on the theory that it's pointless to argue with demagogues. But there's enough of that kind of libel flying around the country right now that we thought it might be worth taking a second to lay out clearly what this show believes on the question of race. Above all, we believe that skin color is not the most important thing about a person. What matters most is how you live, the choices you make, what you love, what you hate, how you treat others. Now, that puts us at odds with the modern left, which classifies people first and foremost by their race. We think that's unfair. Your race is one thing you cannot control. You were born with it. That's why it's wrong to judge people on the basis of it. In fact, that used to be the very definition of racism before liberals changed the rules to exempt themselves from it. Now, this show is based in Washington, D.C., the most democratic city in America, so we know and like a lot of people who call themselves liberal. Many of them are decent human beings, and they're motivated by noble impulses. Some of them sincerely believe that tribalism empowers people. They're wrong. Tribalism diminishes people. It makes their unique qualities irrelevant. It lumps them into a pile with a lot of other people who just happen to look alike. It's dehumanizing. It erases the individual. Unfortunately, it's also politically hard to resist. Groupthink Think and race hatred are remarkably efficient organizing tools, as both parties have proved over the years. And so tribalism flourishes in this country. In the workplace, in the academy, in the media, the left has created systems where people are judged, punished, and rewarded solely based on their immutable characteristics. This is bigotry, the very definition of it. Yet, in an Orwellian sleight of hand for which they become justly famous, the left now claims that all who complain about this are themselves bigots. The most remarkable part is how quickly progressives have forgotten the lessons of the worst things this country ever did, slavery and segregation. Not everyone who looks alike is alike. Collective punishment is immoral. If you find yourself generalizing about entire groups, stop. It never ends well. And more than anything, people are more important than tribes. Every one of them is an individual created by God. Treat them that way. People are all equal, but not everybody thinks they equally deserve the right to say what they think in public. A student op-ed in Ohio suggested speakers ought to be barred from campus if their rhetoric annoys leftists. We'll talk to the author of that piece just ahead. Well, Amari Garrett is a student at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. He recently wrote a piece for the student newspaper in which he says people shouldn't try to play devil's advocate. In other words, they shouldn't ask demanding questions for the sake of understanding opposing views. Doing so, he says, leads, quote, to the security of hate speech under the guise of free speech, which normalizes and makes space for microaggressions, segregation, exclusion, and prejudice. It's easy to make fun of that, hard to understand it, but we must say Amari Garrett was brave enough to come on tonight, and we're grateful for that. So it's good to see you, Amari.
Thank you, Tucker.
So first off, I guess it seems to me the key phrase in the paragraph I just read is hate speech. Mm-hmm. It's not a constitutionally recognized idea. As you know, there's no such thing actually as hate speech. But tell me how it's interpreted on your campus. What's hate speech?
Well, hate speech is speech that comes out of the rhetoric that targets certain groups or individuals because of who they are or their social location in society. And what's more about hate speech is that it usually incites violence and brings harm to these people who white nationalists and white supremacists often target.
So it's speech that targets groups because of their immutable characteristics. So if you were to say, for example, I don't like you because I don't know you, but I see your skin color, you're a beneficiary of white privilege. Would that be hate speech? I'm attacking you because of your membership in a group. It could incite violence. Would that qualify as hate speech?
Most definitely. I think when we are attacking people because of who they are and where they're situated in society, we don't look at where we can change that and how we can reshape society.
Right. Okay. I mean, I agree with you that that's wrong. We just did a segment on it actually about 3 minutes ago, and I sincerely agree with you on that. It's wrong. It happens a lot in our society, and I don't like it. The question, though, is should you try to prevent people from expressing their views even if you dislike them? So, like, do you think it's okay to keep someone from talking if you disagree with that person?
No. So these aren't simple disagreements that we're talking about here. Oftentimes when we're talking about topics of hate speech and free speech and the way in which rhetoric and speech has become so important is because of the demagoguery that has been witnessed throughout the recent election. And oftentimes, historically, the university has been a place of politics, debate, and speech. And so this is nothing new. We know that people like to espouse white nationalists and white supremacist views at campuses around the country and even around the world.
But I guess what is, I mean, that's a debatable point that you just made. But the first point you made is not debatable, that traditionally colleges have been a place where people can say what they think, even if other people disagree. What's new, and I'm old enough to remember it, is that now students like you are saying, no, you're not allowed to express those views here.
Yes,
that's a new thing.
Yes, it is. It is a new thing, and it's because we are now at a space in society where we're concerned for the safety of people right? And so we have a change in society where we are no longer allowing groups of people to be targeted and come under the harm that
how many,
usually,
just at Denison, I've been to Denison in Granville, Ohio. How many students have been killed by white supremacists on your campus recently?
No, nobody's been killed by white supremacy, but I'm sure that there are a lot of people living under the stress of white supremacy and white supremacist views.
If
there
I
are
make
plenty
you,
of white supremacists on the campus of Denison.
So
and if you speak to
right, but hold on. You said that there was the fear of imminent violence, but you're conceding there hasn't actually been any violence. So the standard is if I make you uncomfortable.
It's not about fear of imminent violence. It's about enabling people to carry out microaggressions, whether that be the use of the N-word, the use of different speech. And we're not just talking about.
But what about? Hold on. When you watch television and you see, like in Berkeley, people with black handkerchiefs over their faces hitting other people with chair legs or spraying them with bear spray, that's actual violence, I think you'd agree. And there on the left, does that kind of challenge the storyline?
And the violence that's occurred from the left has been entirely reactionary to the white nationalist violence that has come from groups like the KKK and come from white nationalists. White nationalists are completely invested in violence. White nationalists target.
I wish we had time for me. I don't want to be mean because you're just a kid, but I wish I knew
using violence.
Who taught you this stuff. I wish. Tell your professor, whoever taught you this stuff, to come on the show, because I'd love to talk to him. You're brave to come on, though, and I appreciate it. We're out of time, sadly. Thanks, Omari. Republicans have revealed their plan to overhaul the American tax code. The budget chief from the White House, OMB director, Mick Mulvaney, joins us next. After months of wrangling and talking about it, the Republicans have unveiled their tax plan. If passed, it would be the biggest tax reform, the biggest change to the tax code in more than 3 decades. The proposed bill would cut corporate taxes quite a bit, increase deductions, and otherwise simplify the code substantially. Mick Mulvaney is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the fabled OMB, and he joins us tonight. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So there's always a winner and there's always a loser in any kind of change. Who are the winners under this plan and who are the losers?
I think the winners are probably the middle class. They're going to end up paying less tax, and it's going to be easier for them to pay it. So it's a simpler, fairer system. About 90% of households, I think, Tucker, right now actually hire somebody else to do their taxes. That's not big companies. That's not even small companies. That's families are paying people. Ordinary folks are paying somebody else to do their taxes. And we let them pay less and pay it themselves, pay it more simply. And I think that's a big win for people. I think that the economy writ large is the other big winner here. That's what's driving that corporate tax. I hope we get a chance to talk about that. But a big piece of this, a central piece of this, was the corporate tax rate reduction. We do that to try and drive productivity, drive investment in America, drive economic growth, economic development. So I think the two winners here are the individual families, ordinary Americans, what some people call the middle class. Everybody, of course, everybody considers themselves to be middle class. And then the overall economy, because we're sort of revitalizing that American machine.
So who are the losers?
I think right now, if you probably make a lot of money at the very high end and you have a very expensive house in New York or California, you're probably a loser. Because one of the proposals is to remove the deduction for state and local taxes. And if you're living in a $2 million house in Los Angeles, California, you're going to pay more tax.
So the idea is that if you, and they're almost all blue states that have these, New Jersey, California, New York, have very high property taxes, but they're in effect subsidized by the rest of the country under the current code because they're deductible.
That's why I think that's, we can talk about the economic impact of a lot of these things, and I hope we do, but from a general policy, getting rid of that state and local tax deduction is a great policy, because you're absolutely right. Folks in places like South Carolina have been subsidizing folks who live in New York City for a long time, and it's just not fair. That's why we talk about a more fair tax code and getting rid of those types of
So you say very rich people will pay more. What's the threshold for very rich?
It depends. It's sort of hard to say, and it is. One of the things I think that everybody's learned as we've gone through this is that there is no ordinary American family. There's so many different moving pieces and parts. You could live in a fancy house making a lot of money in a low tax state, and the difference would be, it would be very treatment would be very different than if you're living in a house in a high-tax state. So you asked me who the losers were. Folks who are making a lot of money, living in a very expensive house in California. The winners are a lot of other folks, but it's sort of hard to say in between.
So if I go to work every day and live off the wages that I make,
you're a lot better off.
I'm taxed at one rate. But if I inherit a bunch of money and live off the dividends of the investments of the money that I inherited, I'm taxed at a much lower rate. Why is that fair, and will that come closer into balance?
Say that again. I didn't follow the question. I'm sorry.
Well, our taxes on labor are far higher than the taxes on capital.
Correct.
Right? So if I inherit a bunch of money and live off the dividends of my investments of that money, I'm paying a lot less than someone who just works. So
you're absolutely right.
Fair?
If you're making $50,000 in dividends, is it really going to be different than $50,000 in earnings? To a certain extent, perhaps, but keep in mind, we're increasing the standard deduction here to take it, I think it's to $24,000 for a family, all right, which is a lot of money to be earning in interest if you've inherited from someplace else. But if you're a family making $24,000 a year, your effective rate is 0 on that.
Right.
And I think that's what's more important to you,
But we're still taxing, I mean, we tax things based on whether we think they're good or not. So cigarette taxes are so high and solar panel subsidies are real. So, like, I've never really understood why we tax investments at so much lower rate than we do.
I actually think we're trying to move away from that. Clearly, we don't get rid of all of those discrepancies.
Right.
But we do move away from a tax code that is driven towards behavior. Most of the deductions are gone. Most of the loopholes are gone. In fact, I think the only ones that we're really sort of pushing right now are the charitable deduction and the mortgage interest deduction.
Yep.
Everything else pretty much gone.
So
that tax break you got for buying a solar-powered something or other, I mean, all of that tax code, the use of the tax code to drive your behavior, we try and get rid of because we don't think it's fair.
Quickly, the corporate tax rate, was it 35?
35 now, right?
35 now. You
for
want
C corporations, large corporations, yes.
Bring it down to 20. If you do that, what percentage of companies will actually pay that? Big companies will pay that full 20. What do you think?
Again, we think more will pay that rate than pay the 35% rate now because we get rid of all of these deductions. Keep in mind, one of the things, again, come back to the policies involved with this. At a 35% tax rate, which is a fairly stiff tax rate, in fact, it's the highest of any developed country in the world, right? The power that lobbyists have to go and get a special tax credit or a deduction for your industry is pretty severe because you're paying a very high rate.
I'm laughing because I live next to them, and they all have bigger pools than I do. Yes.
And when you take that rate down to 20%, the ability, the stuff we can give away goes away. That the leverage they have goes away.
No, that's a totally fair point. And if you live here, you see it, and I know you have. Thank you very much for joining us, Mick Mulvaney.
Thanks, Sean.
Up next, the great Dean Cain is here to discuss Hollywood's newest obsession with Russia and the political standards that govern what art is allowed. Stay tuned. Well, a group of executives out in Hollywood recently got a 2-hour briefing on the Moscow Project. That's an effort to find and expose collusion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Actor Dean Cain is from L.A., grew up out there, knows everybody, and of course stars in and makes his own movies. He joins us here. What is this?
I'm going to go see the movie when it comes out. I mean, I can't imagine what it is. I mean, there's a lot of people who are very upset that Donald Trump is president.
Yeah.
They will not accept it, and they will overturn any rock and even probably make up stories to find collusion at this point. And I think that Oliver Stone should probably direct it because he's pretty good at revisionist history.
Well, actually, in point of fact, I've talked to Oliver Stone about this. He doesn't buy any of it, I don't think.
If it's that far-fetched, then it's
doesn't.
really,
Oliver Stone thinks this. I mean, not to speak out of turn, but I don't think Oliver Stone believes this at all.
I don't think anybody believes it. I mean, it's been so long, and where's the proof?
So you've made a movie on the Armenian genocide, and by the way, God bless you for doing that, because it's an important thing, I think, to remember and learn from. But you're having trouble getting it out there because why?
Well, first of all, we had trouble in Glendale, California, which is a huge Armenian population. The diaspora there, it's the second largest group of Armenians in the world. Outside of Armenia, it's the first. It's the largest group. And they wouldn't let us advertise because they called it too political. And we ended up making a big stink about it, got media involved, and they ended up
political?
They say it's political, and we argue, and I argue completely, it's not political at all. It's a human rights story. There's no politics behind it. Is the Holocaust political? No.
Right.
And the problem is that our government hasn't recognized the Armenian genocide. 47 of our 50 states have, but our federal government hasn't, and it's because I think it's because we have an air base in Turkey, and we're trying to keep things nice. And
right, so it implicates the Ottomans, the Turks.
The Turks.
And speaking of foreign influence on our domestic politics, the government of Turkey has an effect on decisions our policymakers make.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of those situations. So I've been lobbying Congress the last couple of days to say, hey, look at this. What we're trying to say is, call it genocide. Acknowledge it as genocide, because if you don't, genocide denied is genocide continued. And it allows other things to be happening today in South Sudan, in Iraq, and in Syria, to the Christians there. It's happening now.
So do you think the fact, I mean, no one ever says this, it wasn't just the Armenians being killed by the Ottoman Turks, it was a Christian minority being slaughtered by a Muslim majority. Do you think that makes it harder for people to acknowledge it was genocide?
I think absolutely it does. And they're not, and that's why they're not acknowledging what's going on today.
What a shame. Well, I'm going to watch it, and I'm glad you made it. Dean Cain, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
We're talking to Sean Hannity next. He's in Washington. We just saw him. We'll be right back. Sadly, the hour is over. Went so fast. Like life itself. Tune in every night at 8 to the show that's the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. DVR it if you haven't already. Professor Alan Dershowitz is speaking at Columbia right now. Here's a live picture of it. Students are protesting him vigorously. He's coming on tomorrow to tell us what exactly happened. Also, Final Exam is back. Your weekly news guest with 2 special contestants. Obviously, you want to play along at home. Good night from Washington. Time for a third night of Sean Hannity at 9 p.m. Massive ratings Monday.